So thank you everybody for joining us and welcome to the Ancestry and Diversity Forum. We're very excited to have you here. We're very excited to have you here in the new format. If you happen to have the old calendar holds for the Zoom meeting format versus the webinar, it should be deleted, but if you either forwarded it to yourself or forwarded it, please go ahead and delete that one. We won't be using that one anymore. We currently have a reminder up in the old invitation for this month, but next month we will not be doing that. So with that logistical piece, I also want to introduce Rachel Shapiro and Jasmine Baker, who will be onboarding as Ancestry and Diversity Working Group coordinators. In particular, Rachel is going to be taking over the forum management, so she will be moderating the discussion at the end of this forum. And Jasmine is going to be responsible for the core ADWG meetings. And then without further ado, I would also love to welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Elizabeth Dietz, who is a postdoctorate fellow in bioethics and the history of genomics at NHGRI, the National Human Genome Research Institute, has a PhD from Arizona State University. Their work, which focuses on bioethics as it pertains to disability rights and LGBTQ issues, examines how the social processes by which fundamental concepts like sex and informed consent and medical necessity come to be important in various contexts to varied ends. Their book project, No Choice But to Choose, looks at how informed consent is used sometimes simultaneously to hold individuals responsible for structural problems, ensure autonomy, define personhood, and call specific accounts of justice into being. And today we're really excited to have him speak. This is kind of a continuation of our August forum. Dr. Karen Parker spoke about her work on SGM minority data and discussions of sex and genomics, as well as sort of a follow-up to some of the discussions we've had previously about how genomics and genomics concepts are used and misused within the context of our larger society. And without further ado, Dr. Dietz, please go ahead and take it away. We also will ask if you have questions during the forum. There is a chat and a Q&A feature. We'll be monitoring both. That being said, we will hold questions till the end of the presentation. So if you have them, feel free to ask. We're just going to kind of hold them and then we'll come back to them when we get to the end. There should also be a raise hand function once we do get to the end, that if you would prefer to speak, you can call on me that way as well. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Carissa, and for the invite to be here and talk to you all today. I've been looking forward to it a ton. I'm going to do that thing that we're all very familiar with after so many years of the pandemic, where I try to make sure I know how to share slides. I think that's working. Okay, cool. All right. So today, I'm going to talk about sex, specifically how it gets defined in a variety of contexts. As Clarissa noted, I'm trying to pick up on the theme of the use and misuse of genomics, specifically, though, as it relates to contemporary legal applications. So this is an important disclaimer. I work for the federal government. These views are definitely my own and do not necessarily represent that of the government as a whole, the NIH, DHHS. But okay, so that's my required disclaimer, but I think more, I think a little bit more about the sorts of things that I would like to claim could be useful. So I'm a social scientist. I have a PhD in bioethics and science and technology studies, which makes me very, very fun at parties. And I understand the work that I do is complementary to and kind of informed by the basic science and clinical work that I understand that many of you in this forum do. So I'm queer, and that's part of why I care about questions related to sex and gender. But at a much more basic level, I think that there's a lot of value in thinking quite carefully about not just what basic science can tell us about the world, but about the processes that produce the things that we think are true, the things that we understand to be real, and how people and politics and the things that we believe and fight over shape the very things that we know. So that's kind of what I'm up to today. So today I'll talk about how that relates to sex, specifically about how in the last few years, different parts of the government have defined sex quite differently. And more importantly, they've done so to very different ends, even though, and this is interesting, right? Their methods bear some similarities to one another. So I think this should be important to all of us because we are all accorded rights and privileges according to sex. And we are all certainly in community with people whose lives are made more challenging by how their sex is categorized. So I'm going to make an overarching claim and then spend the rest of this talk providing context and clarification. So just to manage expectations a little bit as a philosopher type person, I'm going to aim here to make some tacit processes visible and to work through some things that get assumed or they get muddied when science gets translated into policy. I don't really have a grand plan for how to ensure that good science gets translated into just policy for everyone on the basis of sex, or particularly for sexual and gender minorities. But I do think that what I'm about to talk about today is a useful building block for starting such a conversation or continuing it. And I'd be really excited to think with you all about what that could look like in the Q&A. All right, so here's the claim, that there are at least two important ways that government institutions define sex in the US. And those important ways correspond to two important conceptual approaches to the use of science to understand sex. Okay, so on the left of this slide is the kind of definition that the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine offer in a 2022 report on measuring sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation. So the key features of this, there's a bunch of other definitions. It's very, very long. I'm not going to subject you to the whole thing. But what I want to draw out about this is that they've defined sex as a multidimensional construct based on a cluster of anatomical and physical traits, which they call sex traits. So it's a so the bucket of sex is this multidimensional construct, and then within it there's a bunch of dimensions. So we've got there's sex traits like external genitalia, secondary sex characteristics, gonads, chromosomes, hormones. Those are all probably extremely familiar as like the components that make up sex. And then those have characteristics. There's a range of expressions that can exist within them. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the range of possible chromosomal expressions that produce variations in sex characteristics, but the same sort of logic applies to each of these dimensions to varying degrees. Endocrine traits vary enormously across human populations. On the right, we have the reasoning for Oklahoma's binary, rigid, and anatomically based categorization of sex. That there are, quote, definitional, practical, and material differences between the sex that have implications for our law in Oklahoma. To settle this unfounded confusion surrounding such basic questions as what is a woman, this order is intended to provide clarity, certainty, and uniformity to administrative actions and rules. So this isn't the definition itself, but I wanted to start off with like the reason that's given for this was a gubernatorial order. The very same logic exists in dozens of other governor's orders, as well as just like state laws that have been passed. And then they proceed to have a kind of stepwise definition of sex, which ensures that it is always considered to be binary and importantly, very knowable on the basis of some dimension, usually chromosomes, but sometimes physiological traits, but basically, and always knowable at birth. So, okay, so on the left, federal science agencies, sort of this like flexible, indeterminate category, but still a category that's useful. On the right, this kind of state-based approach, which is really invested in providing fixity, rigidity, knowability, and a kind of like absolute, like a final answer to a question that has been deemed really important. So this question of what is a woman is treated as really important. And then the answer comes through. Okay, so federal science agencies are sort of like slowly and haltingly and coming to a consensus answer of sex as multidimensional and context specific. And this is in order to kind of more usefully and actionably measure sex for the purposes of both demographic and scientific inquiry. And state governments, not all of them, but the ones that are passing these sex definition laws, are intent on creating and enforcing rules that, by and large, the kind of sometimes stated, sometimes tacit intent is to ensure that trans people don't use the bathrooms of their lived genders or play on the same gender sports teams. And they do so by offering simple and binary definitions of sex that are designed to create legitimate grounds for legal enforcement of the boundaries between what are taken to be biological sex or biological sexes. Okay, so here's the central distinction that I'd like to make. So it's not just about the definitions themselves, but I want us to think about the conceptual tools that are used to arrive to them. Sometimes the way that we approach the question of understanding what sex is, and you can substitute sex for all sorts of biological inquiry, sometimes this takes the work of of biology and the work of science more generally to be a process. And this happens, in labs and fights and over like how to structure experiments or whatever. But biology is just like a kind of messy process of trying to figure stuff out, that has a bunch of well-defined rules and a bunch of experts that undertake it, but it's not just like known out of whole cloth. The answer is not apparent in advance. But sometimes the idea of biology is not so much about people or processes or questions or challenging assumptions. It's used to say that something is fact. It is biological. It ought not to be questioned. That's the end of the conversation. And so, just to have one more way of trying to compare two things, I've badly made a Venn diagram using PowerPoint, and we'll attempt to never do this again. This is what I want to explore today. When we look to these two ways of figuring out what sex is, the one through the national academies, which extends further, it frames a lot of the ways that we're talking about sex here, where I work at NIH, and the one enumerated in dozens of state laws, as well as a few proposed federal ones that haven't gotten much traction yet, we see two competing underlying epistemic commitments. The science agencies one, which I'm just sort of broadly lumping that together, is aiming for conceptual clarity. And this involves navigating uncertainty, trying to sort through competing accounts. So the National Academy's reports, they're not just like some dude writing a bunch of stuff down, they're consensus reports. They involve long stakeholder processes, something that like a kind of democratic approach to making knowledge. There's fights, there's things that get left out. And so what is produced is a sort of robust account of a way of thinking about a particular topic, in this case, how to understand and define sex. The state law one, on the other hand, uses science as a conceptual justification for conclusions known in advance. So these are pretty distinct ways of thinking and making knowledge, right? But I think it's also there's similarities that make them worth talking about today. And not just saying, well, one is bad and one is good, and that's the end of it. They share enough that I want to kind of work through what that means. So in this talk, I'm going to try to clarify two of those similarities. First, both talk about genomics, specifically the way that sex chromosomes determine a whole host of what we call sex characteristics. And second, which I'll build out a little bit further in the second half of this talk, is that both express some pretty profound values. And this is important, right? We're trained to think of science as aspiring to what Heather Douglas calls a value-free ideal, that the best version of good work is perfectly objective, that it could be replicated anywhere under the right conditions, that what we're aspiring to using our scientific tools is a perfect description of the world as it is. So there's lots of ways, I'm sure, that we can all readily see that attaining this ideal is impossible. But in this talk, I want to go one step further. Of course, we ought to aspire to the kind of rigor that produces replicability, that allows for collaborative science across institutional contexts, and that produces something that we can hold on to as facts or as like truth about the natural world. But I want us to sit with the fact that perfect objectivity is a kind of constitutionally impossible project. There's always going to be values inflecting the categorization choices that we make. We're always going to be people doing work, or there's always going to be choice in our methods and our topics and how we frame, for example, the need for inclusion of diverse populations of study. There's always going to be a bunch of choices that represent values along the way, and we're always going to be people just trying to sort them out. A good friend of mine who works on algorithmic injustice is really fond of noting that there has never once been a system that's designed without bias, scientific, technical, whatever. So our job is just to figure out how to harness and direct that bias for good. So that's kind of one of the things that I'm trying to sit with and thinking through what's going on with these like competing ways of understanding sex. Okay, so let's get into these kind of two frames that I'm trying to work out. First, the one that's modeled by federal science agencies like the national academies, and then next, I'll talk about the state lawmakers ones. So I understand that to this audience, explaining the process of biological study is a little bit like explaining that water is wet to a fish. So I'm not going to go too technical because that would be wrong. But I want to point out a few features of how we do science in the general, and how in particular we deploy genetics and genomics that are of particular relevance to questions of sex categorization. And in particular, I want to note sort of holistically and generally the importance of seeing the project of doing scientific work, not just as something that individuals or teams do at the bench, or as genomic medicine as something isolated to the bedside, or I guess probably very often the Zoom room now. It happens in all sorts of places that make that make possible the kind of knowledge that we have. That's in funding decisions, in the interplay between federal and academic and private institutions, and the kinds of fights that we have with our lab mates that produce, those like 2 a.m. revelations, in peer review, and the kind of feedback or lack of feedback that the kind of currently broken peer review system is producing. So in other words, we don't just learn things because they're discovered in a lab. If and when things are discovered in a lab, it's the product of a whole lot of infrastructure making it possible. So one way to see this a little more concretely is through policy developed where I work at the NIH, specifically related to the use of sex as a biological variable. So this is a policy that requires the consideration of sex as a biological variable, one that can be disaggregated and analyzed independently in all preclinical study, unless there's a compelling reason not to do so. And so this policy, it was enacted in the name of rigor and reproducibility, of making sure that our understanding of complex traits is not inappropriately simplified by the assumption that these traits have nothing to do with sex or sex differences, but it's also about something moral, right, and something ethical, a sense that there is an injustice, not just an error, when men get treated as the stand-in for all of humankind, when conditions specific to women get ignored. This is a double-edged sword. The call to pay attention to sex can be interpreted, particularly by those who are invested in sex as a rigid and fixed binary, as a demand to treat sex in a fixed and rigid way, which isn't like a terribly unfair reading of the policy on sex as a biological variable. This policy aims to ensure that sex get factored into preclinical research. And it might indeed be technically difficult to perform chromosomal or hormonal analysis on every mouse to ensure that some absolute standard of maleness or femaleness is being met, when researchers are concerned with like larger scale aggregated trends anyway. And so the American College of Pediatricians isn't wrong per se when they assert that, quote, the National Institutes of Health urges scientists and physicians to include sex as a biological variable in all aspects of healthcare. Granted, the American College of Pediatricians is a fringe medical association using a very friendly sounding name to draw on associations with the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is the more mainstream organization. But their articulation that, quote, the field of medicine is denying the reality of biological sex runs counter to the account of biology as a process of curiosity and discovery that I've been trying to outline. But they're going to NIH policy as their supporting evidence. What they're arguing is that the NIH says that there are only two sexes and only two ways to know sex, and that NIH's authority as a body who gets to define the terms, and that NIH's authority as a body who gets to define the terms of scientific engagement has closed the book on an understanding of sex. And so since the policy on sex as a biological variable is targeted at creating studies that are able to disaggregate preclinical results by sex, it isn't intrinsically concerned with the political ramifications of articulating only two sex kinds, because mice don't have a gender. Mice aren't discriminated against on the basis of their gender or their sex. They're model animals. But their ability to model breaks down when the relative simplicity of their ability to tell us something about sexually dimorphic traits in model animals is used to stand in for the whole universe of possible understanding of sex, gender, and the human relationships that make them important. So the way that the American College of Pediatricians draws upon sex as a biological variable to argue that NIH says there are only two sexes represents a conceptual error, what I want to call a conceptual error. Sex as a biological variable focuses on a methodological intervention that suggests disaggregation via a binary understanding of sex enhances rigor, but it does not suggest that that is the absolute or only conceptual frame. The possibility of this kind of error, however, suggests that there is work yet to be done for NIH to clarify that such absolute rigidity is neither ethically nor analytically appropriate. So along these lines, there's been a pretty decent amount of critique of the binary frameworks that this policy on sex as a biological variable offers. not because the overall effort to include women and female model organisms in research is flawed, but because the underlying account of what's being studied, of why sex might matter and how, can continually be refined. So these efforts help us to move away from treating the important part of sex from being that it is a kind of obligate binary to being treated more legibly as a variable, as something that is useful in so much as it sheds productive light on an object of study. So here's kind of two complementary approaches to doing that. First, on the left, from Sarah Richardson, who's a historian of science at Harvard, or she and her colleagues have built out an account of what they call sex contextualism. Basically, that says, don't treat sex as this giant bucket of things that's supposed to always mean the same things. If you want to know something about hormone responses, investigate hormone responses. Treat sex as a cluster of variables in context, rather than as a kind of homogeneous, always the same kind of less powerful cluster. And so there's a pretty strong homology with race, right? The contemporary move away from treating race as a kind of fixed and knowable thing to treating it as a social construct that contains a number of features that can themselves be studied. So don't study the race as a proxy, or is often used and often inappropriately used as a proxy for some underlying trait that is actually of scientific of interest. And so second, on the right, just kind of calling back to the National Academy's definition of sex, this gives us those the dimensions on which a sex contextualist approach can be explored. So instead of just looking at an assumption of what sex and the aggregate is, examine chromosomes or hormones or secondary sex characteristics as necessary, and know that the way that they attach to an overarching concept of sex might shift between them. And that's what's interesting about it. So in July of this year, NHGRI with partners, the National Human Genome Research Institute, with partners in the Office of Research in Women's Health and the Sexual and Gender Minority Research Office, tried to take these questions really seriously as well. So we all know that the question of what sex is matters a lot for research, but we also know that genomic explanations are being used all over the place in law and policy, and to pretty harmful ends in a lot of ways. So like it or not, as an institute, makes these questions our business. And I think it was our general contention that just coming up with better and more precise ways to describe what genomics can, and also pretty importantly, what it cannot say about sex, isn't going to get us at any deeper questions of how or why it became so politically important to use scientific explanations for sex categories in so many legal contexts. So we convened a bunch of people, almost 20 of them, many of whom who had never talked at NIH, which was pretty cool, to help us publicly think through these questions. The event, it was pretty incredible to be a part of it. It had almost 1,000 people attend who asked like literally hundreds of questions. I got some emails from trans students noting that scientific institutions rarely treat their experiences like good to think with alongside of on their own terms, rather than just treating trans people and transness as kind of the subject of debate. So the thing felt worthwhile. And I'm going to talk briefly about our methodological approach, which kind of gave us a set of questions to ask in order to round out my picture of the kind of model as biology as process that I'm trying to get at. So there were 3 panels. I'll just briefly describe each of them. And if you're interested in learning more, the full program, along with videos of all of the talks, is available at genome.gov. So the first panelists talked about the science of sex characteristics. What is sex actually? Okay, it's a cluster of traits, many of which are strongly bimodal rather than binary. In humans, these characteristics can change throughout the lifetime. When a person is pregnant, they grow an entire sex-related organ, the placenta, to support fetal development. Hormone levels change throughout the lifetime. Cis and trans people alike modify their hormone levels for a wide variety of reasons related to health, well-being, and gender identity. We talked about the bimodality of sex characteristics, the fact that they tend to cluster around 2 poles, but that some individual dimensions of sex might fall in what is considered to be the male category for one trait and the female for another. We talked about how that's incredibly important to think about when trying to understand what sex is. And so later, I'll talk about how contemporary state level lawmakers are trying to grapple with this kind of variation by treating that kind of variation, kind of difference among even within people, as a set of exceptions from an established norm, rather than constituting a kind of broader or more complicated account of the norm. That's not the approach that the experts at this symposium adopted. Instead, they suggested that it is a matter of epistemic justice, of thinking well about the people who are at stake in scientific research, to understand sex itself to contain multitudes, and that the human impulse to categorize neatly does not match the richness of normal biological expression. So one way to offer some of the relevant science is to note the astounding number of variations in sex characteristics that are possible. This is just an infographic from Scientific American from a couple of years ago that I think does a really nice job of both kind of laying out a bunch of different possible forms of variation, but also depicting sex as something far more complicated and far more interesting than a simple binary. But I also want to make sure that we avoid instrumentalizing intersex people and intersex identities to make that point of complexity. So my focus here is on sex categorization to draw our attention to the fact that categorization itself is a process. It's full of decisions about what variables matter and why they matter to what ends. Okay, so the second set of panels explored how the science of sex relates to the human and bureaucratic impulse to categorize it. Beans Valachi's historical look at the varied ways that sex has been categorized, sometimes to nefarious ends, sometimes to trivial ones, contextualized Paisley Curra's observation that often what sex is a function of who is asking and why. Different people, agencies, and organizations have different criteria for determining what sex is and why they care about it. So it's one thing to impose, as many current laws do, rigid standards about what counts as sex. But adopting those require that we ignore a whole lot of variation, not just in people's bodies, but in the ways that sex might be useful and productive to think about what bodies can do and can and cannot tell us, and about the places where differences in sex both do and do not matter. They might matter differently, for example, at the DMV versus the passport office versus the doctor's office versus the way that how we regard each other, like the Thanksgiving dinner table, comes to be. And as the other speakers in the panels noted, so often the establishment of a hard and fast normal serves to make it possible to discipline or eliminate variations from that normal, a profoundly eugenic logic that has been borne out in the context of sex testing as well. Okay, so finally, we asked, so what? What does a more complicated and frankly messier account of sex actually give us? For one, it refuses to define trans and intersex people out of existence. And I actually do think that's a pretty good day of government work. But the experts who spoke at this event had more to say on the matter. We can build more just systems for data collection. We can see scientific work as inseparable from just and ethical work. We can make technical improvements to how journals collect data related to sex and gender, which will drive how those concepts are operationalized in the future. I think there's like a pretty hopeful and exciting upshot too, which is about the space that thinking capaciously about sex, gender, and genomics opens to do more interesting work. Part of what I'm trying to do today is observe something that the folks in this particular audience already know, that genomic understanding of the world tends towards greater complexity, deeper and more interesting questions, and the need to constantly challenge our priors. The position here at NIH that I have is a kind of genealogical offshoot of the NHGRI's role in the Human Genome Project. It was a big project involving tons of people and money and quite substantial challenges to the very idea of what government-funded basic science should be getting up to. So our archivist, Zach Utz, has curated this really interesting virtual exhibit on our website about initial opposition to the Human Genome Project. A bunch of people took a good bit of time to declare that, quote, the Human Genome Project is simply a bad idea. One of the reasons that many of them gave was that there's no reason to waste time on the merely technical project of sequencing what they called junk DNA. Eric Green, the director of NHGRI here, loves telling the story because like the critics were wrong. There's a lot of ways to describe that they were wrong, including some of them subsequently taking funding related to the Human Genome Project and from NHGRI. But also, Junk DNA, and more precisely, non-coding DNA, is important for all sorts of regulatory and structural reasons. It's incredibly useful for us to know about, even if we didn't know exactly why at the time, when a great deal of money was and time were being invested in understanding it. There was still a reason for doing it, even if we couldn't quite see it at the moment. So there's a kind of earnest upshot to this, right? Other than the, like, I don't know, institutional satisfaction of proving critics wrong. There's a lot of virtue, I think, in an attitude of sustained curiosity. And that curiosity needs resources. There's value in a sense that we might not fully understand something complicated, and that our understanding might shift and reveal functions and mistakes that couldn't have been anticipated from the outset. So far, I've been trying to offer a slight reframing of the scientific project that many of you in the audience are up to remind us of all the things that we know, the things that we can know, that are products not only of the careful work that gets done at the bench, but also of the funding processes, the reporting requirements, the late night fights with lab mates, the reviewers number 1 and 2, the political context in which research directions are forged, and so much more. That scientific complexity is not just something that gets discovered. It's baked into the very infrastructure through which we come to know things about the world. So in his opening remarks to our symposium on sex, gender, and genomics, Eric noted that, quote, "We must establish scientific precision that accounts for this kind of sex and gender multidimensionality, in addition to energetic curiosity to understand it." So in some senses, it's the curiosity that I want to really focus on here. The idea that it's baked into the whole process, leaving room for us to discover genuinely new and interesting things. And some of the speakers offered just that. So Anne Foster Sterling's talk challenged conventions about the strict split between what we think of as sex, a biological phenomenon, and gender, which is generally taken to be a social one, by noting that the ways that we define sex are always inflected by the attitudes and assumptions we have about gender. Perhaps they can't be so tidily separated after all. Melissa Wilson's talk balked at reducing the X and Y chromosomes to merely coding for sex. More sustained and less prescriptive attention to them would reveal, as her lab is working towards, all sorts of important things about cancer development and the role of the placenta and so much more. So you don't get to these questions by assuming a rigid sex binary that leaves no room for complication. Why would we assume such a thing? Well, here's one answer for why we might. And there's tons of examples like this. I'm coming back to the same one so that you can sit with it for a little longer. But I read all of the laws passed in 2023 concerning LGBT rights and coded what ended up being all 39 unique instances in which such laws offered a statutory definition of what sex is. So the part in the beginning of a law that just like lays out, here's what all the terms mean. Those are all fascinating and a little bit horrifying. And so all 39 unique instances in which sex is defined as fixed, binary, and knowable, generally through genomics or something that is genetically coded for, there's an enormous amount of similarity across all of them. They really don't disagree, which is also kind of interesting if we're thinking about how knowledge gets made and what counts in like the way that we understand what biology can tell us. So this one is is the executive order from the governor of Oklahoma. And it gets us to the reason for the reasons that are at stake for providing the statutory definitions. And it's to provide clarity, certainty, and uniformity to administrative actions and rules. And it, again, goes on to define sex as fixed, knowable, and binary. So one more just brief example of this. These are pretty easy to find online, but if you shoot me an email, I can send you a lot more. If this is something that you want to do some light reading on. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who is the current governor of Arkansas, offers additional conceptual reasoning, but certainly in conversation with the one we just looked at. So she uses the language of feminism. Title IX represented important advances for women. Women need to be protected. Contemporary woke politics and science have not better explained biology. Rather, they have redefined what in fact should be thought of as simple, knowable, and essential for the protection of women. So there's a stark conceptual distinction between women and men that needs to be protected, and that protection can be operationalized through law. This is really interesting, right? I mean, it's like horrifying in some senses, but it draws upon the progressive struggle for women's liberation of several generations ago, saying it was right, it was necessary. In fact, it was so right and necessary that we now need to double down and protect the very rights that were, those few generations ago, foreclosed by the very same political actors that now seek to defend them from what they now see as the risk, the harm of trans women refusing or receiving them, trans women that these laws aim to define as men. So the conceptual focus of this effort for our purposes is on the way that genomics are being used. Sex is being defined by the state of Arkansas as, quote, on the basis of biology. So here, biology is rigid. It doesn't permit the kind of flexibility, multidimensionality, or what I would hope to be curiosity that, for example, many biologists wish to incorporate into their study. But here's a brief aside. We're all I suspect we're all pretty familiar with this move. Sometimes trust the science, or science is real, is an argument that's used by people across the political spectrum to argue that science has already produced the best answer, that matters are too urgent for the kinds of questions that might undermine it. Science gets held as rigid, as fixed, as a set of answers, rather than a careful process by all sorts of people looking to substantiate all sorts of noble and sometimes less than noble claims. So I think it's pretty important that we try to understand those claims, even when they do us harm, rather than simply just writing them off as ignorant. The facts might be contestable. To be clear, I don't think that any of these laws are getting the science like totally right or particularly useful in that pursuit. But I also don't think that fighting bad facts with better facts is going to get around the ways that these are questions much more of values than they are of facts. And besides, this is the wild part. These are laws now. In a funny way, these accounts of what sex is and its rigid, binary, chromosomally determined nature are the ones that are going to come to bear most strongly on the real people who will be legally required to use particular bathrooms or not play on sports teams or be outed to their parents or denied medical care. The facts are what the law says in that sense. So here's just a few specific examples just to kind of further substantiate the way that these laws are defining sex, but they're broadly representative of the dozens and dozens more that exist. So in Idaho, sex is the immutable biological and physiological characteristics, specifically the chromosomes, and an internal and external reproductive anatomy, genetically determined at conception and generally recognizable at birth, that define an individual as male or female. So binary, fixed, at birth chromosomes. Idaho's got it all. In Iowa, sex means the biological indication of male and female, including sex chromosomes, naturally occurring sex hormones, et cetera, et cetera. I just think Kansas's is just sort of interesting. Sex means biological sex, either male or female at birth. With respect to biological sex, the term equal does not mean same or identical. And with respect to biological sex, separate accommodations are not inherently unequal. So here's a definition that's clearly signaling why the definition is made to matter. So the law doesn't come from nowhere. One of the many processes that brings us, particularly state level law, is through advocacy organizations enumerating model legislation and proposing it to sympathetic lawmakers. And that's very much what has happened with many, many of these bills. This kind of framing that these are important in supporting women and supporting women's rights has gotten a lot of traction. This is a screenshot from the advocacy organization that published the model legislation that would become several of these laws. But what I want to draw your attention to is the logic that they offer. You can Google the Women's Bill of Rights and you can find the original text or the ways that it made it into law. They're very proud of this pipeline. It's not hidden at all. But the underlying logic is that sex is obvious. It's not just that it's biological, but it's simple. We need to clarify our common understanding. We need to stand for science just as we stand for common sense. Science is the obvious explanation. It helps us to see that it is fixed and rigid, but it's overly complicated to have a different kind of understanding of sex. You know what a sex is when you see it, and you can identify the people that have them quite readily. This is similarly another advocacy organization that works this in the UK, but on very similar kinds of projects, of lawmaking projects. What is sex? It's knowable at conception, and it's easy to tell what sex most adults are, even at a glance. Stop making things so complicated. All right, so what? I've argued that it is useful to be able to distinguish between the different ways that the science is being used, the idea of science is being used. that it's useful to distinguish between when it is used to honor complexity and the science as a process versus to legitimize a conclusion known in advance. So I don't think that this is just a technical distinction. I hope that's clear already. I think it's one that helps us to tease out some important underlying values and to make determinations about how we ought to relate to those values in response. So to make this more concrete, I have one more example to show you. And for that, we will travel back in time to 2018. So at that time, the Trump administration leaked, or I don't know where the active voice is. A memo was leaked by the Trump administration, and the New York Times got its hand on it. I have not been able to find this memo. It's every source that I have been able to find just points back to this New York Times report, which is itself sort of interesting. There's a lot of mystery surrounding it, particularly in the kind of activist discourse that emerged from it. But this memo sought to define sex. It was one of the earliest enumerated efforts that would, in the 6 years since, these efforts have really, really skyrocketed. So the quotes that the New York Times published from what this memo said was that sex means a person's status as male or female based on immutable biological traits identifiable before birth, by or before birth, and the sex listed on a person's birth certificate as originally used shall constitute definitive proof of a person's sex. So, okay, it's knowable, it's bureaucratic, cool, except when it is rebutted by reliable genetic evidence, which introduces a whole process, right? Most of the laws that exist now don't have this like verification process built in, but Utah did. Like they invented a whole system for sex testing people in cases of sex controversy, which is a pretty wild bureaucratic apparatus to develop, particularly related to kids. But we'll set that aside for a moment. What I want to draw out though is the way that this initial round of discourse went. There were a lot of people, I among them, that were very, very worried about what this would mean, particularly for trans people trying to go about their lives. And so a lot of different arguments were formed and a lot of different approaches to saying, hey, this is unscientific and bad and harmful got developed. And I want to focus on just one of those, which this article, which is by a really excellent like queer podcaster slash writer in the culture. So the argument that they laid out draws upon the science or what could have been presumed to be the underlying scientific rationale based on what was knowable about this leaked policy. The Trump administration says it wants to define sex on a biological basis, but it gets the science wrong. And the science that it gets wrong, according to Tuck and a number of other authors, I'm not trying to pick on them in any way, but this was a key way of saying, hey, don't you get it? This doesn't match what we know. The science is incorrect. Was to note that this kind of fixed and rigid understanding of what sex is completely writes out all kinds of variation in sex. The variations that are experienced by intersex people, but also just the like quotidian differences that people experience across their lifetimes. Every one of us is going to have different hormone levels at different times of the month or periods in their life. Our secondary sex characteristics are going to shift. Our sexes in some ways just sort of fundamentally change in ways that are sort of like uncontroversial and kind of boring until they become the basis for this kind of like legal interrogation and action. We don't know everything about what the Trump admin was putting forth as its framework for fully defining sex, but we do know that essentially every single law that defines sex now has this kind of carve out in it that says sex is binary, rigid, flexible, knowable at birth, and science says that there is variation. Now we're going to deal with it. So it creates carve outs for intersex people and then specifically enumerates a bunch of kinds of variations in sex characteristics that are not to be kind of captured by these laws, that are accepted by the law. So, in other words, these laws attempt to create stark categorical distinctions between sexes. And they do engage with the science. They recognize that the world isn't organized into the precise, easy binaries that they try to call into being. That's something science also says. So this is our crux. this is where the distinctions that I'm trying to show how the science or the idea of science is used, that this is where I think they really come to matter. These are the value-laden distinctions, the same sorts of ones that are constantly happening during all sorts of scientific classification and in all manners of struggle for truth. This is where they come into being. Given the set of facts that binary sex is supposed to be important and that biology presents exceptions to human-made classification systems, these laws honor those exceptions. They define a normal. The normal is XX and XY, it's male and female. But then they acknowledge that there are some people who, through no fault of their own, who are not participating in gender radicalism or trying to fraudulently identify as the other sex, which are kind of the mainstream anti-trans ways of framing the problem of trans people. People through no fault of their own experience these differences of sex ought not to be disciplined by these categories. They are accepted from these laws. It does not apply to them because their kind of sex does not prove that normal is more interesting or more complicated than a binary. It simply renders them an accident, an exception, an outlier to be discarded. So it doesn't need to be this way. How we engage with results we do not expect is an ethical choice, which is also to say it is a scientific choice. In this case, it has quite high stakes for how the law in dozens of states in the US permits trans and intersex people to simply go about their lives. Okay, so what? This is where the sort of like, well, this is kind of the shape of the world as I see it now. Now we have to figure out what to do with it. So the basic takeaways that I'm arriving at this point in this work are that we always need to see categorization as a profoundly ethically significant act. It is fundamental to the doing of scientific work, and it is always normative. It is always a bunch of decisions. And genomic accounts of the world can be effectively used both to understand and to justify things known in advance. I think it's a pretty easy leap to see the ways that this works with, for example, genetic essentialist understandings of the world, which don't seem so far away from these kinds of sex essentialist understandings of the world. But I do think that understanding the stakes of this latter move, the move to use science as a kind of justification, can help direct us towards a more curious approach to using genomic science as a project of understanding. All right, that is all I had for you today, and I'm really excited for conversation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dietz. That was fabulously interesting. And I'll mention something that caught me off guard was the American Society of Pediatricians versus the Academy of Pediatrics, something I will definitely be very aware of in the future. But if anyone has questions for Dr. Dietz, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you. And I believe Jasmine actually had a question.
I did. So first of all, great talk. I was very excited to see like the science and the political side of things kind of merge into a presentation. So I'm trying to mentally figure out on a day-to-day basis, what types of things would have the largest effect on people? Would it be the federal interpretation of sex, or would it be the state laws that are being put in place or attempting to be put in place, rather?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think what we're seeing bear out, unfortunately, is the power of the state laws, because I think they sort of didactically relate to like categorization questions. Which bathroom do you use? Are you allowed to play on a sports team? But a lot of them are pretty ambitiously targeted at gender affirming care for youth. So that's where it's sort of like the stakes are being felt highest, I think, for honestly for kids who are like, well, I can't receive medical care, or my doctor might be criminalized for participating in it. this question is also really interesting because the US is this odd outlier for right now. So I'm doing a bunch of other work trying to understand like medical advocacy around gender affirming care. And what's really stark is that particularly in the UK, there has been this huge push to move from what had been a kind of, well, it's like basically settled, we'll just sort of let trans people kind of exist. They'll get coverage under an admittedly stretched national healthcare system, to saying we need to rethink the way that we're treating trans people and the medical care available to them. But that kind of rethinking at a medical association and institutional level in the US isn't quite happening. And it feels a little fraught, and who knows what the upcoming years hold. But one of the reasons that thinking about medical associations is so interesting to me right now, and the like who gets to claim that they are the pediatric organization, is that all of the major medical associations are in lockstep, that gender affirming care is medically necessary, clinically appropriate, the right thing to do. And that kind of expertise continues to hold some sway and clashes really dramatically at the state level, particularly when laws try to draw upon what medicine says. Medicine is still in the United States saying, nope, nope, we're basically fine with this. We'd like to practice medicine.
So we have a couple questions in the Q&A. The first is from Sharon Plon. And it says, I thought I've seen letters of concerns from health investigators outside the US on definitions of women's health as opposed to language that is more anatomical to include transgender individuals. And I've also given Sharon the opportunity to speak if she wanted to say more or ask more. But comments, Dr. Dietz?
Yeah, I mean, so for example, consent forms that say it's eligible to a woman as opposed to language that says eligible to an individual with a uterus.
Yeah. And just sort of like, what are the stakes of that? Or is there controversy going on there? This kind of definition, these kind of definition questions are always like interesting as a community matter, because I think there's a couple approaches you can take. You can say, is our primary focus on accuracy? And if our primary focus is on accuracy, then I can guarantee you that like sometimes there's going to be a trans guy that really does need gynecological care. Your consent form at the gynecologist office, if you want to be perfectly accurate, is going to be more accurate if you have anatomically based language. But I think there's always like this is why I think it's so important to make sure we're always in conversation with the way that our scientific processes are fundamentally social. Like these are the way that we think about women's health in particular is the legacy of generations of advocacy and struggle in reaction to it being denied. And so there is a lot of, I think, community understanding that like there's women exist, women's health exists. The point is the sort of violence of maintaining the borders between that exclude, rather than the need to always make sure that there's a kind of like sometimes uncomfortable political point being made. So I think that I mean I often just sort of like balk at some of the way that in particular the right takes up critique of these moves to more accurate language, because that kind of more accurate language, it is more, I think it is like literally and technically more inclusive, but it's rarely the hill that trans people are going to die on. The hill that they are much more invested in is something about access to that care and some way of knowing that that care is going to be available. So I often think it's sort of the wrong fight to have, but it's interesting to know when it's being had. I'm not sure if that answers
I raise it because this was a group of British investigators. Several of them are prominent geneticists that we work with. And so I'm just saying this sort of goes outside the US political system.
Oh, yeah.
And they
Absolutely.
were being asked to use anatomically correct language. And they wrote a letter of sort of protest about that because of sort of the history of women's health issues. So I just wanted to sort of broaden it.
Yeah, thank you. I think that those remain like sort of interesting and live questions. And the best that I can offer is sort of just trying to get at why they're being asked and who is our bias towards, I guess. Who are we treating as like the important focus of these kinds of questions.
Another question that was posted from Emerson Dusick. Do you think the villainization of trans people in public policy is directly related to misrepresentation of science biology in describing sex, or public misunderstandings of science more broadly, thinking about how the title of the Arkansas bill was framed as protecting women? So I'll pass to you and also allow Emerson to talk.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I don't think it really has anything to do with science. Anne Fausto Sterling has this really good piece that I assigned to my undergrad ethics students, but also just because I like it a lot, that makes the argument that science won't settle trans rights. And so she talks about how she gets called upon as an expert by pro and anti-trans constituents in different times and in different ways to try to be used like as both on both of their sides. And her overarching point is essentially like, these are not matters of, this isn't about a better factual understanding. I don't think that the order of operations is from a kind of understanding or misunderstanding of the biological world to a set of values. I think it works in the other way. That's why I think it's so important. That's kind of what I'm trying to get at with noting that like we hope that biology helps us to understand the world around us. But I think what we're seeing in a lot of these laws is that biology is being used to justify positions held in advance. And that trades on the idea that like we're supposed to use science to understand things better. But I just don't think that that's the origin point. I don't think people confront a more nuanced or a less nuanced account of sex, and that's their moment of rupture. I think there's something else going on. And I think we can see this sociologically in the way that care or attention or fear is differently and much more strenuously directed towards trans people in the last couple of years. That doesn't come out of people inventing it for themselves or simply meeting new or trans people or not meeting new trans people. There is a larger kind of political discussion that has been happening that kind of contextualizes new frameworks for thinking about the potential stakes for trans inclusion in the world. It is markedly different than a couple of years ago.
So I want to be sensitive to the time. It's 10 o'clock, which is officially the end of our time together. There is one more question in the chat. Dr. Dietz, if you have availability to go a couple minutes long, I'm happy to ask it to you.
Yeah, I can talk for more minutes.
Sure. Yeah, the last question was just from Anna Lewis. What's the role and impact of elite sports in this discourse?
As the proving ground for all of the difficult philosophy. I'm going to punt slightly because I'm not terribly interested in resolving any of those questions, and that's what I got a doctorate to not do. But I do think that elite sports help us to work out to ask better questions about this stuff. And I think the hill that I'm most interested in dying on with the question of sports, and I think it's interesting and probably very deliberate that that you asked this in the context of elite sports and not sports generally, is that we saw these questions of sex testing play out in the Olympics recently. There was a lot of desire to know genetically what the Algerian boxer's sex was, and from that was to follow the correct moral determination. But I think that the questions are actually much more live in sports more generally, where we're not asking the very narrow questions for just a few people about like, are livelihoods at stake? Am I going to get sponsorships or whatnot? But rather it's more about like, why do we care about sports so much? Why are sports so important in the United States? Are they because we should like, they're a place for people to learn about fairness or do physical activity? And I kind of want to note that the legal ramifications, the legal approaches to these questions have much more bearing on like the kinds of sports that people just play from when they're kids to when they're in college. And there's a sense that there's this promissory note for sports in the US that if you play sports, it's kind of a ticket out for a lot of people. And so there's always a future promise that if we're really, really good, that's when it's going to really matter. But I think one of, I guess, maybe the parting conceptual frame is that a lot of these bills make these big conceptual points about the value of people or how they should be categorized or how they should be excluded. And they're always very targeted. The number of people that are actually subject to them is often like 1 or 2 in a state. There's like almost no trans girls trying to play sports in Idaho. But now we have huge new frameworks for ensuring that no trans girls play sports in Idaho. And I think those are the kinds of questions that I want to start with when thinking about why sports come to matter, rather than trying to adjudicate the particularities of like what the right hormone levels are. I will leave that to other people.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dietz, for sticking around a couple extra minutes for that last question. And thank you more broadly and everyone for joining the forum today. And we look forward to seeing you all again next month.